Good evening and welcome to Avenues to Wholeness, Understanding Addiction. My name is Reverend Lathalma Yempata, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the Associate Executive Director for American Baptist Women's Ministries. American Baptist Women's Ministries is a Christ-centered ministry with a commitment to encourage and empower women and girls to serve God. American Baptist Women's Ministries is a diverse community of American Baptist women and girls serving in ministry in Christ's name in the U.S., including Puerto Rico, as well as internationally. With local, area, region, state, and national levels of ministry, American Baptist Women's Ministries strives to create and sustain communities of passionately faithful, mission-minded women and girls engaged in worship, service, and friendship. Our ministries include domestic violence and human trafficking prevention and education, building beloved community, and developing leaders. This is the 5th webinar of the season. We have one more webinar on December 5th covering financial wellness. You can register and find out more about our upcoming webinar by visiting our website, www.abwomensministries.org/webinars. Here are some guidelines for your time with us this evening. You'll be muted throughout the presentation. However, you may use your raise hand icon during question and answer to be unmuted to ask a question, or you may type your question into the question box in your control panels. If you see a question written that is close to your question or is your question, you can upvote to emphasize another person's question, and we will address that question first. Lastly, but certainly not least, please make sure to complete the survey provided at the end of this webinar so that we can continue providing you with outstanding webinars. It is truly an honor to introduce our presenter for this evening, the Reverend Sonia Waters, PhD. She received her BA in Literature with a minor in Gender Studies from Wheaton College, her MDiv with honors from the General Seminary of the Episcopal Church, and her PhD in Pastoral Theology from Princeton Theological Seminary. She is an Episcopal priest with 10 years of experience in parish ministry and prior experience in feminist advocacy work focused on violence against women. Her research interests includes addiction studies, visual culture and media, feminist and womanist pastoral theology, attachment and family systems theories, and relational perspectives on the self. She is the author of Addiction and Pastoral Care, which was published in 2019. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Reverend Dr. Waters. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Waters.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. You can hear me, right?
Yes, you sound clear.
Okay, can you see the slides as well? Are we all good?
All good.
That's amazing. Well, I'm so glad to be here. I don't know if you all can see me. Can you? Or should I show myself to my audience here?
We can see you.
Okay, you can see me? Good. Okay, great. I'm so glad. Because it seems weird to just to see the PowerPoint, right? When we're talking about something so personal. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm really delighted to, I'm blessed really to be able to take my passion and share it with you. And knowing that there are so many strong women out there who are excited about their faith and want to learn more about how to serve. And so I'm just really delighted to be with you. And of course, I know Lathalma, and so deep in my heart, what a woman, what a woman. So I'm really glad to be here. My topic today is addiction and spirituality. It's really hard to think of a good title for such a topic. But what I really want to talk about is let you know a little bit about addiction, but then also try to think about the spiritual effects of addiction. So I want to frame the spiritual problem of addiction as one of pain, in the hopes that we can move from simply addressing the behavior, like excessive use, to addressing the varied reasons behind the behavior, like loss, attachment difficulties, trauma, social identity issues, self-worth, practical issues, financial issues, cultural issues, racism and sexism in this world. There are many points of pain that are behind the behaviors we take on to try to survive our lives. And I want that for the church to be our perspective moving forward. When we come across somebody who is addicted, either behaviorally or substance addicted, although I tend to work more in substances, that our compassion comes from a place of knowing that Jesus was someone who walked with people in sickness, and walk with people in pain, and we wish to serve Jesus by doing likewise. So I want to talk a little bit about addiction as a neurobiological condition that will get us to the sickness part of it, and then try to talk about the experience of addiction as a deep spiritual loss, an entrapment that overtakes someone. Not all people who are addicted are innocent. They do a lot of harm. But part of our compassion, especially as pastoral care providers, especially as leaders in our church, is to try to take the stigma away from this condition and understand that it's complicated, and that we do things even in our weaknesses that hurt others. So let me give you a few facts. Oh, that's my book, by the way. I'm very excited. Thank you for bringing it up, Lethelma. Okay, but this is more important. Okay, so let me give you some statistics, right? In 2017, approximately 19.7 million people aged 12 or older had a substance use disorder. 19.7 million related to the use of alcohol or illicit drugs. That's 14.5 million people who had an alcohol use disorder, and 7.5 million people who had an illicit drug disorder. The most common illicit use disorder was marijuana. An estimated 2.1 million people had an opioid use disorder. 1.7 million people a prescription pain reliever use disorder, and 0.7 million people a heroin use disorder. So there are probably more people with addictions in the world than there are Baptists. And so then, therefore, we know that they're in our communities and they're in our congregations as well. The United States itself is the biggest opioid consumer globally, accounting for almost 100% of the world's hydrocodone and 81% of oxycodone use. We use a lot of painkillers in our country, and I think you've seen a lot on the news what that means for the addiction crisis in our country. If you work with adolescents or you work with older adults, an estimated 443,000 adolescents aged 12 to 17 have an alcohol use disorder, and 3% had an illicit drug use disorder from 12 years old, 12 to 17. That's about 741,000 children, basically, adolescents with a problem. But also, we often think about this as a young person's problem. Over 1/10 of older adults in the United States are estimated to be binge drinkers. And older adults have also a problem that they will drink without eating a lot and make themselves more ill. And also that older adults tend to be on anywhere from 4 to 7 kinds of medications and don't realize how the medications are affected by what they drink. And sometimes also they're on pain relievers, which can be problematic as well. And so this is an issue that affects all ages. And that's important for us to remember, so it's not sort of somebody out there. It could just easily be any one of us. If we happen to need to take painkillers for a time, if we happen to be social drinkers and sort of fall into the pattern. So it's dangerous for all of us. And that helps keep us, keep our compassion. Okay, so this means, of course, there are a lot of addicts in the world, and therefore in our pews. But how do we know someone is addicted? We say addiction is a disease, but you can't really take a blood test. You can't get x-rayed for it. You discern it often through the consequences of people's behavior and through how we self-report its effects on our lives. This is the DSM-5 symptom list for substance use disorder. It's a bit wordy, but I had a lot to fit on one slide. And I want you to see it because I don't know if you get sent these slides, or I can send them to Lethelma to send to you. But this is a really good way to think about our own alcohol or drug use, as well as share this with other people, or if you're concerned about other people. Because sometimes people don't realize, they don't make the connections between their substance use and the consequences. But when we see this list, we see it very strongly. Alcohol is often taken in larger amounts over a longer period than intended. There's efforts to cut down that fail. A great deal of time is spent in activities, so they use more and more time around the use. This is for alcohol, but this is the same for substance use. Actually, it's the same for pornography addiction, and the same for gambling. This basic criteria is very similar. A great deal of time is spent in these activities, craving or a strong desire to use alcohol. And then consequences, continuing to use even though you fail major role obligations, continue to use in spite of consequences, continue to use even when it's dangerous to your physical or mental health. So it's this kind of this sense really of spiritual entrapment. We're no longer even aware, no longer even making the connections between our actions, between our use and what's happening to us. And there's a strange kind of possession that takes over us. Tolerance and withdrawal are also important in figuring this out. So if you have somebody in your life, it's not our job to tell anybody they're an alcoholic. They need to figure it out on their own. But you know, if you or somebody else is very proud of how much you can drink, and you developed it over time, that's tolerance. So be careful. Keep an eye on that. Because if you keep on needing to drink and drink a lot, it can grow into a problem. And then withdrawal. The characteristic withdrawal syndrome for alcohol includes issues like shaking, anxiety, difficulty focusing or taking in information, all the way to what's called delirium tremens, which is like you get tachycardia, and sweats. You can even have hallucinations. It's really interesting actually, because the news always talks about opioids. Alcohol is one of the most dangerous substances we have. So if you are withdrawing, so if you go in recovery, let's say, and you're withdrawing from opioids, the saying in Alcoholics Anonymous is that when you're withdrawing from heroin, you feel like you're going to die. When you're withdrawing from alcohol, you might die. Because you might have a heart attack, because the withdrawals can be so bad for those who are very chronic users. So this is a basic symptom list, but already you can see that it's kind of hard to know, right? Maybe you're just a heavy drinker. Maybe you're just going through a bad time in your life. It's self-reported, so maybe you're really having some consequences in your life just because you're in the process of a bad breakup, or you really are getting fired from your job. So sometimes it's hard for people to know which one follows the other. And so it's really important to keep an eye on this list and talk it out with people. It also goes from mild to severe. So if you really get a few of these, you might have a mild problem, more moderate, and many of them, it's severe. And all of these variables make it kind of hard to know. And so the people we love, and sometimes we ourselves, kind of struggle to know, do I really have a problem? I mean, I think I could stop at any time. I stopped before for 6 months, so surely I could stop again. You know, so we keep on telling ourselves these stories, and it becomes hard to put the whole package together and realize that it's interconnected. Okay, so this is the DSM-5 symptom list. So let's talk a little bit about addiction as a disease. So addiction is characterized, this is according to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, by the inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, craving, diminished recognition of significant problems, a dysfunctional emotional response. It can cycle through relapse and remission, and it's progressive and can result in disability or early death. This definition is much more manageable, really, smaller, something that you can hold on to, and you might notice it in yourself or others. Now, according to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, addiction is a disease, and it is a neurobiological disease that progresses over time. So I'm going to give you some technical terms, and then we're going to go quickly out of them. But addiction is basically a perfect storm in the brain. It includes the desensitization of reward circuits, which is called often called the reward center of the brain, which dampens our ability to feel pleasure and the motivation to pursue everyday activities. And then the other side, it tunnels you towards drug using, so that only dopamine spikes only at drug using or substance using, and that really is what makes you feel alive. It's what's the most salient in your environment, what you most strive for. Two, the increasing strength of conditioned responses to stress reactivity. We get more and more stressed out the more and more we become addicted. And this results in increased cravings and negative emotions when the cravings are not sated. It also means we develop cues in our environment to use. So we become behaviorally cued to use, and we become everything from just a little bit anxious or uncomfortable to outright annoyed when we're cued into the behavior and are not able to fulfill it. And also the weakening of the prefrontal cortex brain regions involved in executive functions such as decision-making, inhibitory control, and self-regulation. So basically what you have in addiction is an exaggerated go and a shut-off stop. Like in all of our lives, right? There's certain things where our reward center says go, and we know that the rest of ourselves should say stop, right? We see a cute person across the room who does not belong to us, and our reward center says go, and our executive function says no, they belong to somebody else, or no, that's not to my values, or whatever, and says stop, right? And do not approach that person, don't ask them for their phone number. Or we see a great piece of chocolate cake, right? And our reward center says go. Hopefully, if we've already had 3 pieces of chocolate cake, our executive function say, no, you've already had enough chocolate cake, you don't need it anymore. But in addiction, that stop function gets taken offline. And the go function becomes not about a variety of rewards, but tunnel vision towards the use of drugs and alcohol. So here it is in a little bit more human language. So intoxication is caused by exciting or dampening how the brain communicates. It's called neurotransmission. By changing how the brain functions, drugs and alcohol affect changes to mood, behavior, and also sensory perception, depending on the drug. As the user continues to flood these chemical highways of the brain, these neurotransmission pathways begin to adjust to try to manage the effect of the drug. The user then needs more of the drug to get the same effect. And this is called tolerance. More and more use also means we're becoming behaviorally conditioned to use in response to a wide range of emotional states, relationships, activities, or environments. So if I keep on responding to everything with the same action, over time, I'm going to behaviorally cue, like Pavlov's dog, the bell rings and the dog salivates, right? Now the bell rings, it's a warm sunny day, it's a cold day, it's a rainy day, it's a nice day, it's a bad day. It's early in the morning, I wake up and I smoke a cigarette, it's late at night, I smoke before I go to bed. I wake up in the morning and with my coffee, I smoke weed, and then I move on to gin, and then I move on. So we develop over our lives these patterns around alcohol, like we would around anything. Now, when I wake up in the morning, I immediately want to brush my teeth because I'm a responsible adult. But if everything that you do is cued into using, you'll wake up and the first thing you'll think about is using. So life becomes cued into using. The more use also means that we withdraw more. And the more we withdraw, the more that we need the substance in order to balance ourselves back out again, right? So the behavior of using is experienced first as rewarding, and it spikes dopamine in the reward center of the brain. But this is also a neurotransmission part of the brain, and over time it adjusts. And we need more and more again the substance to get the same result. And so over time, the brain incorporates heavy substance use into its functioning. The brain kind of realizes this is what's going to go on now. And so it tries to dampen the effect. And the more it tries to dampen the effect, the more we use to get the same high. And so that means when we're not using, the effect is dampened and we're in withdrawal. and we have to use to feel normal. We have to use more to feel high. And that's how it develops. So over time, there's an intensification of the behavior, leading to increased time and thought spent on the behavior, limits to other interests, often becoming intoxicated alone when you used to be intoxicated with others. People may feel great guilt or shame about the amount they're using or their actions when intoxicated. And so it becomes a loop. I feel shame. I do perhaps things that I am ashamed of when intoxicated, or I'm victimized. Things happen to me when I'm intoxicated. And then I use more to manage those experiences. So it's both changes in the brain, but also the idea that everything in my environment might cue me to use, but also I'm experiencing a stress and turmoil. And I know that drugs and alcohol will take it away, right? So the brain gets more and more involved in that until we need to use to feel normal. So basically, drugs and alcohol provide some pretty important benefits. Now, we can get these benefits in other places. In fact, all of these benefits we get in church as well, and we get in our spirituality, and we get in prayer. But sometimes a drug or an alcohol seems a bit easier than that, especially for young people, right? We sort of slide into it. But so it's important to understand that we don't use drugs and alcohol just to be irresponsible. I mean, sometimes when we're young, we're exploring our lives, right? And we're just living into the glorification of what it means to be adventurous or whatever. But over time, really, we use for some particular benefits. We use drugs and alcohol because it regulates our emotion, affect regulation, how we're feeling, our emotion states. We use for stress management. Many people, many just everyday people go home and say, oh my God, after that day, I just want to drink. Just give me a glass of wine. It's been a terrible day, right? That very common response is sort of exploded in alcoholism. We use for a ritual and social relationship. People use to be parts of sororities, parts of fraternities. They use because now, at least often in mainline traditions, there's alcohol everywhere. I don't know how the Baptists are doing with that. But for a lot of traditions, there's alcohol at church, or there's alcohol events with alcohol. I mean, there's a lot of alcohol around. Or perhaps we're part of a rebellious group, and so we're using coke, or we're using heroin. So, but it still binds us to a grouping somehow, right? And drugs and alcohol also provide a solution to survive multiple risk factors across our lives. And what I mean by that is that there's not sort of one reason why people use. People use drugs and alcohol because they have a variety of, to excess, should I say. People use drugs and alcohol to excess because of a variety of vulnerabilities in their lives that come together in drug and alcohol use take them away. Right, so we know that early childhood trauma is strongly related to early onset of drug and alcohol use. We know that adverse childhood conditions of poverty, chaotic families, divorce or abandonment by parents can be part of the picture of early drug and alcohol use. We know that racism and also homophobia or experiences of marginalization can be coped with through drugs and alcohol. That doesn't mean that everybody who experiences those things then becomes addicted, but they're a coping skill for difficult social experiences as well as difficult personal experiences. And so substance use can symbolize an aspect of social identity. It can be the glamorous life. We're exciting, we're having fun, but we can also be strongly motivated to use to cover up grief and loss, separation, divorce, things that are really hurting us, depression, things that we don't know how to deal with on our own. We don't have the recourse or the resources to manage, and so we turn to substances, sometimes not even realizing we're doing it. So this is what drugs and alcohol provide. But what is particularly evil about addictions is that when you actually become addicted, all of these benefits flip. So long-term use instead increases negative affect. It dysregulates the natural stress response. It becomes a chronic compulsive ritual triggered by cues in the environment instead of a way to identify with others and to be social. It now causes multiple neurobiological and social problems. So it was once a coping skill that we used to survive. And then by the time we're addicted, we have to survive it. For me, this is really the spiritual entrapment of addictions. Nobody starts using wanting to be an addict. We start using because we were created so fragile. We're so fragile in our creation. We're blessed by God to be fragile because it means we can love each other and need God and grow in beautiful ways. But within that fragility is also this risk and this deep risk. And this is what to me is particularly evil, is that the bargain really turns against people. And so there's a lot of pain hiding behind the use. All right, I've got a little bit more time before I open it up, and I really want to know what you think or what you're concerned about that I might be able to help you with. So causes of addiction. Again, it's important to realize that there are many causes, right? So we often see somebody who is addicted, and we think, oh, they either fell into the streets or fell into peer pressure, or perhaps they're weak of will, or perhaps they're irresponsible. So we have a lot of negative stigmas. When you imagine addiction, what you're going to imagine is that there are a variety of causes, different for each person, that come together in addiction. And that's also why some people might be able to recover pretty easily. They can stop, they can go to the rehab or go to NA or AA. They can access that help and they can recover. But that person who can do that might not also have a mental health issue like depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or anxiety, right? Perhaps that person also has resources. They can leave their kids with their parents and go to rehab. They have money to pay for rehab. They can get out. They can get out of their job for long enough to do that. They don't have a history of trauma that keeps on getting triggered that they don't quite understand, that keeps leading them back to needing drugs and alcohol to help them with those feelings. They might not be in an environment where all of their friends are using or all their friends are engaged in minor criminality, and that's part of their social lives. We leave those neighborhoods, get sober, and then come back to those neighborhoods. It's very hard because these are your people. These are your family. So there are many different kinds of reasons why it can be, why one becomes addicted, and many kinds of reasons why it's difficult to recover, or why it might be easier for some and harder for others. And why is this important for us as Christian leaders? It's important first because we tend to work in language of weakness of the will and sin. And so it's important to realize it's not so easy. It's not just like, one person they're just a bad apple. They just never could get it. They were just never responsible enough. We have a lot of stigma that we bring to it, but instead, as Christians, we can realize that there's a hurt person before us, a person who's suffering, and that they're complex. They're a child of God, and they're complex people, beloved by God. This also helps because if your church is thinking about doing ministry, why don't you can also kind of imagine how you might engage that ministry. For instance, if you're in a community where people might need help with practical issues, like looking for jobs, like childcare, like understanding insurance, where they might need a trauma-informed care, where they might need help with stress. I mean, there are many different kinds of ways that we can help. It might be a group of older adults who feel lonely and need to be able to come together in a support group and support each other. Families need to support each other. So there's many kinds of ways that we can think about helping people. So so why this is important to me is addiction is a progressive sickness, and it's based on brain changes. Those brain changes deeply affect our connection to God and to others. The more that the neurobiology changes, the more that we lose empathy for others. The more we become completely self-involved. The more we cannot be present to our children or to our families in the way that we would be able to if we were sober. The more we might be full of anger or rage or victimization and self-pity, but we're certainly not connected to God in a deep discipleship kind of way. And so the progressive sickness deeply affects our connection to what's most important, which is God and those whom God has put in our lives. So that means the spiritual problem grows from the neurobiological condition. And why that's important, we tend to think that that addiction is only the issue of sin, and while I'm not against that, if sin is something that you like to talk about, but one of the issues with the sin perspective is that's not really where we can help the most. Where we can help the most is understanding people as sick, because Jesus is a healer, and understanding people as spiritually oppressed, because Jesus released people from their spiritual oppressions. And so we can think about sort of like culpability, what's their problem, or we can think about what's our responsibility, and that helps to shift that a little bit. So for Christians, both the neurological and spiritual condition can be understood as a spiritual oppression. In my book, I use the example of the Gerasene demoniac, because I feel like that example really captures what it is to have both a sickness and a spiritual oppression, in the sense that he is completely removed from his community. He has been chained, and incarceration is a huge part of addiction. A huge part of the trauma of addiction, and is the war on drugs. He has been pushed to the outskirts of society, and everybody's pretty much given up on him. And they've tried to punish him, they've tried to control him, and they won't be controlled. And what's important about that story is that Jesus really meets the Gerasene where he's at. And he does not, there are other places. Mark is full of Jesus sort of walking around and pulling out demons left and right. But in this one, Jesus takes a lot of time. He doesn't change this condition right away. And he kind of bargains with the Gerasene. So he works with him sort of at his level. And that becomes important for us too. We also tend to like to deal with cases in church. I mean, I do anyway. Maybe it's just me. Cases in church that are gratifying. When we help people and they're thankful and we all feel good and we all gain something from that, and that's really good. But it's not always gratifying to work with people who have addictions because of this deep neurobiological problem. And so it's important for us to realize that it grows from suffering so that we can develop compassionate eyes. That there is something oppressed about the will in addictions. It's not simply that they don't want to change, and there's a real neurobiological problem there. And then it's self-harming. It's also other harming. I don't want to deny that, but it's self-harming as well. And it immerses the person in pain. So when we think about the soul sickness of addiction, when we think about the spiritual problem of addiction, it's really a disconnection from self, other, and a higher power. It entraps the self and really prevents much growth. Because when we grow as disciples, we grow by taking in the experience of the world and relating it back to our faith. Taking in experience of the world and relating it back to those we love. Taking in the experience and thinking about it. But in addictions, you are no longer taking in experiences. You're in a perpetual loop. of craving, withdrawal, and intoxication. So making excuses, misperceiving your life, detached, right? We become progressively more self-centered, and we hurt others, and we lack empathy, and we make poor moral choices. There's a saying in AA recovery that that normal people adjust their behaviors to their goals, while addicts adjust their goals to their behaviors. You get less and less standards as you go. There's some kind of combination of feelings. People are either full of pride and rage, which often hides shame. They are either a victim or a victimizer, or sometimes both. And there's a lot of ambivalence, rationalization, resistance, and denial. People describe being addicted as like being underwater. It's like being held underwater, and they see that life is happening around them, but they just can't get out of the water. And addicts care. They care deeply about their families. They care deeply about their children, and yet at the same time, they don't care at all. Both of those realities are true, and that's part of what happens to the reward system of the brain, because it's the only salient thing becomes addiction, and becomes the intoxication. And in the end, though, what's really important to know is that it's not that they do not love their families. It's that the only way they know how to feel normal anymore is to use, and because the brain now requires an outside source to maintain its functioning. And so without use, life feels deadened and painful, and withdrawn, going through withdrawals. So there are many different kinds of spiritual conditions, but this is a particular group of problems that I find anyway arise from this particular condition. And so let me see if I have one more slide. Yes, okay, I just want to show you this one slide. So if addiction is a form of spirituality, these are its core beliefs. I am bad. That's what you will hear over and over again, deep down inside of you actually talk to. Sometimes it's I'm bad resistance, and sometimes it's I'm bad shame, you know. If I'm not bad, I'm a victim, but probably underneath, I'm bad. I cannot trust anyone. It's me against the world. My actions are unforgivable. That's a theological statement there, and I've heard it many a time. My pain is immersive, and I cannot heal or let go of my pain. I am a failure, and this is my destiny. God or fate has abandoned me or punishing me. This is really important for us to know as Christians. People who have some Christian background will often interpret their addiction as a punishment from God. So we have to rethink about how we talk about these things. No one will meet my needs. I cannot survive or know who I am without my behavior. Who am I going to be if I don't do this habit? Have no clue. And I feel better when I'm bad, and I'm uncomfortable around the good. And getting drunk or high communicates my pain or my rage. Right? So these are some of the deep spiritual issues that need healing. So even if somebody is in AA recovery, even if somebody's going to rehab, or they stop on their own, it's very possible to have natural recovery if you have enough resources. Still, people need a place to develop their spiritual lives, to manage guilt, to let go of pain, to seek forgiveness. And that's really where the church can do wonders by teaching that Jesus has come to heal the sick and free the captive. And that's what we can offer. I don't want to talk too much because I wanted to leave enough time, I think, for you guys to ask questions or have concerns. And so is that okay, Lathama? You're my boss.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I was like, keep going. It's so good.
Oh, I can talk forever. I can talk forever about this stuff.
No, thank you so much. This has been really helpful for me. So we just want to open up the time that we have left for questions, comments, experiences that you want to share with Dr. Waters to just see, to get her insight, or any questions that you may have with what she's presented so far. I know for me, I really, while we're waiting for people to think of questions, because I know they're burning with questions, is to really talk about what we have to offer. Because I think a lot of times, at least for me, having relationships with folks who are affected by addiction, feeling like just saying, that Jesus, that, can free the oppressed is not enough, especially those who have been in church all of their lives. They know this already. And they're in that place of, I feel better when I'm bad, or like, who am I without this behavior? And I just struggle with what to say or how to be present with them, because I want to be like, well, my inclination is like, you can change, like you, in some areas, especially if they're very strong-willed in other areas of their life, you're like, oh, well, you do it in this area of your life, like why is this so hard? And I find myself frustrated and not knowing what to do, just being present, but afraid that this thing is going to take them out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not, and you make a great point, that especially people who've grown up in church, have either, one may have had some bad experiences, so that they're sort of pushing it away for that reason, or two, if they feel ashamed for their behavior, then they kind of resist by pushing away and sort of noticing all the bad things about church, because they don't want to kind of deal with the protecting their stash, right? They're protecting their condition. There's a theory, and I talk about it in my book, called change theory. And when you're thinking about like the different times, or different ways to talk to somebody about addiction, and there are times when people will hear nothing. They just will hear nothing. They're on their way. And then, and according to the theory anyway, at that time, you really can't argue them out of it. But you can notice and sort of reflect back the discrepancies between their behaviors, and their values, as they bring it up. And also sort of like lift up the discrepancies between their behaviors and their consequences over time. But it is true that that simple language is not going to help, because it's a benefit right now. The other thing to do, the other thing that Christians never do and might want to do some more, is ask why people like what they do. Because we know it's bad, and so we go straight to the bad instead of maybe saying, what does it do for you? Because it's a benefit, and it's really good to join with people in a benefit and find out why they do what they do. It's sort of a first step to get your foot in the door for later change. But it's scary. It's scary.
True. Because someone just asked the question, how can you help someone to acknowledge their addiction?
Yeah. I mean, that's the question. You can't force somebody. It doesn't usually work. Usually, one of the theories is that if somebody's ambivalent or protective of their condition, the more you nag them, the more they run. So like you can never quite catch up. The more you nag them, the more they want. And so it becomes, and then you sometimes develop with somebody, especially if they're a family member, a relational pattern where you're like always nagging them and they're always fighting back, or you're always kind of like sneaking in that comment about what they're doing, and they're always like, oh yeah, I'm the bad kid, or I'm the bad whatever, and then you're developing kind of a pattern that's really hard to get out of. And so that becomes very difficult. But it is true that there is some research that suggests that confrontations done well are helpful, and confrontations include showing somebody the pattern of behavior you see in a non-judgmental manner, telling them what it looks like to you from that DSM-5 guide, and then asking them what they think. And so that you're real kind of up and honest with them. So if I'm dealing with somebody who's like, oh, well, I don't know, Sonia, maybe I'll just keep drinking beer because I love craft beer. All right. Well, you can keep doing that, but you might want to pay attention to if you keep on drinking and can't stop. If you have to kind of drink earlier and earlier in the day, if you keep feeling bad, because maybe that means you've got a problem. It's progressive, and so those are those are two basic ideas. But the thing you want to avoid is getting into a pattern where they can pretty much finish your sentence because they've heard it all before, because you're just not going to get anywhere then.
That's great. We have a question. I often hear those closest to an addict called enabler. How can we discern the difference between enabling and supporting an addict?
Oh yeah, that's really hard. You know, that's really, it's especially hard, I think, for as Christians. We want to heal, we want to help, we want to be supportive. As Christian mothers and as Christian partners, we want to be there for our loved ones and be good spouses. You know, we've made vows, and so it becomes very difficult to know how to discern these things. Enabling is everybody has to find what they can live with, frankly, especially if it's a child. So I've known some parents who said, you know, I can't kick my kid out. I just can't do it, you know, but I can set boundaries, right? I can not give them money. I can not put up with certain behaviors. So each person with a family member has to kind of sit down and be honest about what will the limits be. How will I respond when they test my limits? As sort of coolly and as matter-of-factly as possible, how am I going to respond? And what limits are too much for me? What limits are just too much? Everybody has to live with themselves and their choices. In the end, you can't save an addict. Certainly, you can enable them by, you know, giving them money, by excusing them, by calling in work and saying that they were sick, and all those kinds of things. But for a lot of family, it's a life and death concern. You know, it's a big concern, and that one you have to decide prayerfully where your limits will be. But what's best is to really think them through. And make them clear, and even find somebody who's a good friend you can practice them with. And when this happens, what am I going to say? Because relationships are just so toxic, and it's so hard not to be reactive. So I hope that helps. It's sad for families. Yeah.
We had another question. If you know of any resources or agencies in the Philly area that can come and speak at a church.
In the Philly area? Yeah, that's a good question. I can get back to you. There's actually a church who's doing one of our students, and I can't remember the name of her church off the top of my head, but I think they're doing a ministry to the opioid epidemic in Philly. And I know that she's going to come, Hannah Lehman. I know she's coming to speak to my class next month. So I can get that information to Lethelma. If you want somebody really close,
also maybe you're available.
Oh yes, and my agent Lethelma tells me I'm also available.
That's right.
Although probably not until the end of the middle of next semester. So
she's a busy woman.
Okay,
we have the questions are rolling.
Oh, all right.
Okay, so where could family members go to receive support as their loved ones also receive support for their experience?
Yeah, and there are a lot fewer places for family. I just wish more churches would gather together with all mental health issues and make support groups for families. It's so important right now. But families, the most accessible and free is Al-Anon groups. And so I know that there's a 24 Club, which is an AA clubhouse in our neighborhood that has also an Al-Anon meeting, and there are ones around. But going to an Al-Anon, very much like going to AA, really depends on the people, right? So you can go to one and it can be just like, and then try another. So that there's it's because it's kind of like a church. It's just a group of people gathering. It really depends on the people about whether or not you find it supportive and good enough. So you try a couple. Unfortunately, there are programs for addicts that include a family element to them, like you go for family therapy with the addict. And there are a couple of broad programs, like there's one in New Mexico. But you know, surprisingly enough, there's not as much for families. There's just not as much for families support-wise. Yeah.
Yes. The next question is, you speak of their condition as being spiritually oppressed. What kind of prayer language would you suggest with it? That's a really good question.
That's a really good question, and I appreciate that question. Funny for an Episcopalian, my last church had a healing ministry that was very charismatic. I was still at that church when La Thelma was around at the seminary. And so there are two things that I've heard. I am really comfortable with. That's a really good question. That there are different experiences. I've heard some people who are ready to hear it, who have gone into a healing prayer and have been, and it's been prayed over them for the removal of the spirit of addiction, and they have felt themselves healed, and the removal of the pain of it, and they felt themselves healed. There are also many stories of people who kind of go over and over again to heal a healing group and keep on getting the same prayer, and it's not their time for that kind of prayer, and then they pull out of church because they feel like they're disappointing the healing prayer because they're not getting healed. So there's an interesting dynamic there. I think my personal prayer would be that the Lord would remove the spiritual oppression of addiction, and that we would be healed in body, mind, and spirit, clear brain, strong heart, and courage to continue the work of discipleship and recovery. I think I would combine those elements, and including in a really deep healing prayer, to really include those elements of pain that are behind the addiction. Nobody talks about that. If you could reach in spiritually and ask the Lord to bless those places of emptiness and loneliness and shame and guilt, those traumas, those losses that are deep inside. I think that for me anyway, I would approve of that kind of prayer. That really touched the holistic nature of the condition and called upon the Holy Spirit to enter into that holistic experience of suffering. It's often the case that addiction is a long process of healing, which is why the Gary St. Devoniac is an interesting story for me. And so then there's a question of both the spirit of addiction, but also the spirit of temptation, the spirit of the desire for strength, or the need for strength, the need for wise hands and feet. So there are a lot of different prayer needs, and the more the better. I hope that was helpful. I don't know. Every church is a different way of doing it.
I think that's very helpful. She said thank you, so well. It was helpful. Last question, okay, before we go back to showing your book so that people already, just to make sure people know what it looks like to order it. You already kind of touched on this previously with my question, but just wanted to address this question. Is it possible, or how can we help someone who's not ready to deal with their addiction?
Oh yeah, right. That is the hardest question. When I talk to people in recovery, it's a mixed bag. There are people who feel who again get into a pattern with their loved ones where they're the bad guy, and so they go into treatment to get them off their back. But it is consistent consequences can be helpful. So I can't stop you from using, but I can tell you what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in my presence, and I can I won't be able to necessarily stop you from using, but I can let you know that if you are high or drunk in my presence, you need to leave, and we can talk when you sober up. Like so we can set limits with people, but with family members, as you know, those are very hard limits to hold. So I'm thinking about a couple of guys in the AA program who talk about how they had a big consequence. They felt really guilty. They went to rehab. They were feeling pretty good, getting ready to go home, and their spouses said, "You're not coming home. I want 6 months of sobriety before you come home. You need to go to a halfway house." And it was then that it became real. So sometimes people call, your bottom right before you're going to lose. You've either lost the most important thing, you're about to lose it. But you know that's rolling some dice, because sometimes people are so in the thralls of addiction that it doesn't make a difference. So then some confrontation is useful, but don't get into a pattern of it so that you become that nag and they just ignore you. Boundaries that are clear, and sometimes sticking to your guns about consequences with those closest to you kind of brings it home. But in the end, what we have to realize, not we don't have to, I mean, you got to do what you got to do, right? But it's really painful. You need to find your own healing prayer group as well. I mean, you need your own healing prayer. It's really, really painful for family members to live with someone who has addiction, or to have grown up in a house with addiction. And those are deep wounds that need Jesus's healing. And we don't. Everybody's in Jesus's hands. We can't heal anybody. That's Jesus' job. But we can pray for them, and we can we continue to set the standards that matter to us. So yeah, it's hard, guys.
Everybody's saying, very helpful. Thank you so much. No, this was very helpful. And I think also like your point about facing how even I grew up in a house of where my mom struggled with addiction. So just thinking about, okay, how has that affected me? That's what I'm taking away from this conversation. It's like, what kind of healing do I need in regards to that? Because I think, because you kind of distance yourself from that experience. Okay, that you're being affected, not me.
Yeah, you have to survive the environment. Yeah, but then at some point, every person needs to kind of just go, when as the Lord gives you strength and stability to be able to say, okay, well, I think I'm ready now. I think I'm ready. For bits and bits of it, not all at once. Just bits and bits.
Okay. Thank you so much
Thank you guys for having me.
Yes. Do you mind showing your book one more time, just so? Yeah. Okay, you wrote that book. Okay, you got to show it. I am a publicist. And yes. Please purchase this book. There's a lot of helpful resources inside and frameworks. I'm looking forward to digging in.
The other good book to buy is called The Recovery Minded Church. That's another really good one.
Okay.
Yeah. Especially for people who want to do recovery ministries. It's just a really nice basic book. So I just wanted to make sure. I don't want it to be all about me. I think that's.
I'm good with that. I'm good with it being all about you too. Okay.
So, all right, guys. God bless.
So much. Yes, and please take the survey at the end. We would love to hear your feedback. And we pray that this webinar was as helpful and inspirational as it was for me. I hope it was the same for you all. Thank you so much, Dr. Waters, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, good to see you. Bye.
Good to see you. Good night, everyone. Night.